All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We have a short time together, so we want to maximize all of that. So welcome to residents and researchers. My name is Natalie Sampson. I'm a co-leader here at the Community Engagement Core of the Michigan Center on Life Stage Environmental Exposures and Disease. Many of you know that as M-LEEaD. I'm also an associate professor at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, where I teach courses in environmental health and community organizing. So this event, I want to acknowledge, was organized by M-LEEaD's Community Engagement Core, the Stakeholder Advocacy, Board, and Integrated Health Science Core. It's also co-sponsored by some other units at the University of Michigan School of Public Health, including the Environmental Health Sciences Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and the HBHE Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Collaborative. And I encourage you to go and view. You should have received information if you registered for this event, some of the past events that have been fantastic in the last year or so in this series. So there's a lot of other talks that should be engaging as well. So really quickly, I just want to get a sense of who's in the room. We have our speakers, Zeina and Samra'a on, but I wanted to see maybe by show of hands or in the chat, how many of you have spent time in the south end of Dearborn? Maybe throw it in the chat a lot. Think about that. Yes, Christine, a lot. I'm seeing a lot of littles. So Michiganders who've been in the region, almost none. So just think about that. You know, some folks in this room are new to the region that we'll be talking about today. Some of you may know it quite well. And so you'll hear from Samra'a and you'll hear from Zeina and myself about some of the great things about the South End and some of the environmental threats and challenges that residents face. Okay, so I'll introduce you to our guests. These are two people that I mentioned that I feel really lucky to know. Both of them I consider friends. We collaborate in a lot of different ways work-wise, but they're beautiful humans that I look up to. And so first of all, we have Zeina Reda. She's a third-year undergraduate student at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She's majoring in political science and minoring in law, justice, and social change. She's an Arab American passionate about empowering youth in her community to fight against environmental racism and advocate for increased MENA, Middle Eastern, North African representation. Zeina also currently serves as the youth coordinator for the community-based academic partnership EHRA and has been involved in the efforts since 2018 as a high school student, might I add. And we also have Samra'a Luqman, who is a proud Yemeni American and a fierce advocate for decades in Dearborn, Southend, and beyond. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology from University of Michigan. She works as a legal admin specialist with the federal government. And she has many hats that she wears, including on the board of Friends of the Rouge and a member of the Environmental Health Research to Action Steering Committee, PFAS Alliance, Clean Air Council, Concerned Residents for South Dearborn. And she's spoken in front of local, state, national audiences on issues of environmental justice. So we're lucky to have these two here today. So for a quick agenda, we're just going to talk about, we have a handful of slides, but we want to have some conversation with you all too. Start with a little history. All of us sort of agree that you can't talk about some of these environmental justice issues without talking about history, whether it's policy, zoning, land use decisions. We'll talk about some of the injustices in the south end of Dearborn with data, with personal experiences. And then we want to bring it to some solutions and show what some youth are doing and maybe even have a call to action for you all who are on this call. So finally, we'll make sure for some Q&A at the end. So to get us started, I am going to hand us off to Samra'a and we can go to the next slide.
Thank you, Natalie, Dr. Sampson, for the wonderful introduction and just your overall, all your work in getting our residents' voices heard. To talk to you a little bit about the South End is to talk to you about the immigrant experience and minorities in general, what they face across the U.S. The South End simply happens to be a glaring example of one of the worst cases of environmental injustice. And it didn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen with one particular law or instant or decision that is made either at the local, state, or federal level. It happens in incongruent with all three levels of government basically failing a population. So to start with, I want to talk to you about the history of the South End and how we got to where we are today. The South End really, when you hear the terms the Motor City, it's not talking just about Detroit, it's actually talking about the South End, because right on Mill Road in the heart of the South End is where Ford produces the number one vehicle in the United States, the F-150. Right there, there's also 3 steel mills and a whole slew of auto suppliers that come with it. And for that have gotten to where it was required a lot of municipal changes in zoning, a lot of state changes as far as taxes and allowing certain companies to go in certain places. And with the failure of the federal government in implementing the Clinton's resolution back in 1993 to ensure that there's racial equity in environmental justice. How we got to where we are is because of Ford. So Ford being where it is, it had an insatiable appetite for cheap labor. And what that meant was that you are essentially going to be hiring minority people to your workforce. So it brought in a lot of minorities. Now, minorities couldn't just go everywhere and anywhere that they chose. This map right here shows you the map of redlining. And redlining was not, removed or made illegal until the 70s. So this is very, very recent. What redlining basically meant was that there were parts on a map that they literally would draw lines and say, immigrants or people of color could only purchase homes in X area. So in addition to that, we saw a lot of immigrants that needed to work in the factories, needing to be near the factories, come to only an area that was specifically allocated for them. Once they were there, the city started doing what we call urban renewal. And we'll get a little bit more into that. But essentially what this means is that since the supplier is here, since there's an immigrant community here, what we would start doing as a city or a state would be to put all the unwanted factories in these specific areas. And what's notable is that if you were to take this redlining map and overlay it with a map of contamination in Southeast Michigan in these specific areas, you would see that the highest level of contamination and pollution is essentially exactly the same as the map of redlining. So for the next slide, Meredith, I want to show you, this is the South End in its true form. And what you would see, is the satellite image there and in the map next to it, is that the entire area is surrounded by industry. In the satellite image, you can see how there's so much gray and brown, and that's what we refer to as gray infrastructure, with only limited amounts of green infrastructure. It may seem like it's a little bit of green there, but if you were to look at this next to other parts of the town or other parts of the southeastern Michigan, you would see that our green infrastructure is only about 10% of what the entire South End area is, whereas the factories covering the 48120 are about 90%. In other parts of town, you would see them at about 70% tree coverage, which is very sad. On the left side, the map there, you can see the labels, all of the pink that is over there, whether it's inside or outside of the South End, all of that pink is industrial zoning. And that happened because of what was mentioned earlier, urban renewal. Basically what that meant is Mayor Hubbard at the time decided that he would buy out houses and businesses in the South End. He would demolish and destroy those homes, and he would rezone them as industry or industrial, heavy industrial. So what we have is more trucking. We see about 10,000 trucks per day. You see more, the Marathon Refinery, the AK Steel, the U.S. Steel Plant, the Dearborn Industrial Generator Plant, which is a utility company that was basically constructed just so it could feed energy and electricity into the surrounding steel mill and the Fort Rouge plant. So that in combination with all the other suppliers that came there, the painting for the automotives, the steel processing through Max Steel, Levy, which processes the slag out of the steel mill, all of these different companies contribute to some amount of pollution. When you look at each individual company, I like to look at it if you think of a metaphor of waste baskets. So the state comes in and says, okay, every company is allowed to throw one bubblegum wrapper into a waste basket. But the state doesn't say that you have to limit the amount of wrappers in any one basket. So you have 20 companies throwing 20 wrappers into the Southend's garbage bin, and no limit. That is what we call cumulative health impact. When you need to start looking at how many wrappers can actually go into this garbage bin, especially if this particular area is already overflowed. This particular area, it has been in non-attainment, meaning it's in non-compliance for sulfur dioxide and ozone particulate matter, which means for the last more than 10 years, the air is unsafe for human health to breathe. It is to the point or degree that we receive what we call air quality alerts from Eagle, which tells you, on any given day, you have an orange alert. If you compare that to basically the terror alerts we used to receive when you go into the airport and whatnot, it tells you there's a danger for you to go outside and breathe the air. So you're asked not to barbecue, not to use your car, not to mow your lawn, and generally speaking, not to even exert yourself outdoors, especially if you have asthma or you're elderly or you're very young and susceptible. So it really truly impacts our quality of life all the way around. And then you can go to the next slide. And I believe Zeina will take over. I know I touched on some of these things, but she'll talk to you a little bit more about the specifics as far as the contamination. Thank you.
Thank you, Samra'a. So to add a bit of numbers and statistics to what Samra'a just shared, there are over 40 industries in the area that contribute to emissions of hazardous pollutions, metals, and fugitive dust. And like Samra'a said, historically until this day, the city of Dearborn fails to meet some of the air quality standards set by the government, which we call non-attainment of legal standards. So parts of Dearborn have been in non-attainment for sulfur dioxide since 2010, and Southeast Dearborn specifically has a higher rate of particulate matter 2.5 pollution than 98% of the state. So on the next slide, there's a photo that also shows the air emission sources in the area with a focus on certain cities in Metro Detroit. And the figure also shows areas in which air monitors have been put into place to regulate and monitor these pollutants. And specifically in the area that surrounds Melvindale, Detroit, River Rouge, and Dearborn, there are almost a dozen, if not more, key air sources that contribute to pollution in the area, but not nearly as many monitors put in place in that vicinity. So clearly, there's a disproportionate distribution of air monitors compared to air sources in the area. And then on the next slide, speaking of disproportionate, there are many risk factors associated with air pollution that contribute to disproportionate health burdens on communities of color and low-income families. The three pollutants we mentioned previously, ozone, PM2.5, and sulfur dioxide, which we said are found in levels beyond what they should be, are known contributors to health implications such as increased risk for heart attacks and asthma. And from the chart on the left, which shows the age-adjusted prevalence percentages for several health outcomes, we can see that the prevalence of diseases like arthritis, asthma, and COPD occur at a higher rate among adults living in Dearborn compared to adults in the country. And when looking at this statistic, it's also important to keep in mind the rate of adults without health insurance in these areas. In Southeast Dearborn specifically, 21.1% of adults lack health insurance, and in Dearborn, 13.1% of adults lack health insurance. So again, there's this clear disproportionate distribution of health burdens and a disproportionate access to healthcare on communities in Dearborn, and exposure to air pollutants and toxins only makes things worse. On the next slide, I wanted to also recognize that in addition to the air quality injustices that communities in Southeast Michigan face, there are also several cities in Wayne County that have experienced several major flooding events in the past year. And there are many health effects associated with flooding, including GI issues, respiratory issues, and psychological distress.
What I can also add to this slide is that it kind of shows you, these are pictures actually from the South End exclusively. The bottom picture there is a very, very moving and telling one. This is actually a field with a basketball court and an entire street that is turned into a lake. If you look at the dates at the top right, these are some of the recent major flood events in Wayne County. However, the South End experiences flooding in this magnitude even more frequently than most of the rest of the county does. So instead of having the 7-year flood, we have the 2 to 3 year flood. And this is also attributed to some of the things that we're dealing with being a downriver community and being a community, as was mentioned, of people with low income who don't have health care, who are predominantly immigrants. Initially, they came and they were segregated into the area, but now it's become an enclave where people kind of come here as a landing mat. It's a welcoming community, but they lack the language. They have the language barriers. They lack the knowledge on education on pollution matters. Mind you, a lot of the Yemeni, 96% of the South End is Yemeni American or Yemeni immigrants. And so they come from a third world country where they live in areas where there's not a factory nearby. So coming to America for the first time, and this is something that I experienced when I came to Dearborn, although I've lived in other areas, I came at an age of 6 years old. I never understood that not seeing factories was a normal part of life until my adulthood. I never realized that suburbs did not contain this level of flooding or pollution or smoke, or even if you were to wipe your windowsill and have soot on there, that this was actually irregular. This was not normal for American life. So a lot of the people here don't speak up, don't realize what is actually a travesty against their community. So that's, if we go to the next slide, Meredith, that's part of the another thing that we're ailing from is the flooding, because we're downriver as well. Now, one of the things I could tell you on my street alone, I'm not even going to go into the next couple blocks. I'm just going to go from stop sign to stop sign. There are 12 houses on my street, and that's because there's a field nearby. But in those 12 houses, at least 4 people that I know of personally have had tumors removed. At least 3 others have had a cancer diagnosis, and 2 others have died of cancer. This is within my street alone. Now, what is lacking here is the fact that we don't have health surveys or studies in our area. Of course, those cost money, but it requires some level of knowledge on the part of universities or people of higher learning to know that there is an issue here and come and do that work. We know we can take numbers from hospitalizations from asthma or deaths related to X, Y, and Z, or neighboring areas like the 48127, where a study was conducted that asthma rates, for example, are 1 in 6 in this area. But we're at ground zero, and we are lacking that kind of investment in study and research. So if we could get more researchers to help in that endeavor, that would actually be a way of telling and making the case for cumulative health changes at the state level and otherwise. Now, other things that we have to deal with in the South End, besides the flooding, besides the air pollution and quality, you have to deal with the roads being broken because of the 10,000 trucks that come. You have to deal with the sound that come from the Dearborn Industrial Generator, for example. It's a constant jet-like sound. It's white noise. And there's even research studies about how this noise affects people's sanity. It's to the point where it's like in the middle of the night, 1 o'clock in the morning, the trains are at 80 decibels. We have the smell or violations or the smell nuisances, where the steel mill has a byproduct called slag, and they don't spray it appropriately, and therefore the sulfur comes into our community. If you go outside and you play in the South End and you come indoors, you smell like goats, like sulfur, like methane. It's horrible. And then you also have lights from the different businesses. You have fugitive dust, which is if you have ever driven on the road and there's ever dust, like in a country or rural setting, you have that on major roads in the South End. And it's because trucks are tracking out dust. Now, this dust is not only bad for visibility on the roads, but it's also bad for your lungs, because once these particulate matter gets into your lungs, there's no way you can get them out. And is what causes asthma or COPD or what have you. In fact, there's studies that show that lungs of people living in urban areas are often similar to lungs of smokers living in rural areas. So just to give you the magnitude or a visual of how bad the air quality is here. So one of the things that we also didn't help was the fact that the Middle Eastern, North African population was not included as a minority in the census. And so because we're not able to be classified as one and get funding that would help for grants to research these things or invest in this area. Next slide. So what are the solutions that we can get to kind of mitigate or reduce or fix this? One of the things we often talk about is like when we have lawsuits, penalties are assessed to companies, and those penalties often go to the state's general fund. What they should do is those penalties need to go back to impacted areas. It would be done, like, for example, one of the supplemental environmental projects that we call them, that we had a few years back, was to install a filtration system into our intermediate school, an air filtration system to clean the air as kids are in school. The problem is the air is so bad that the filters went bad after 5 years when they were supposed to last 10 years. Another thing that we look to are hoping for and are fighting for is what I mentioned briefly earlier, cumulative health impacts. So if there's studies that show that even if you're meeting the criteria and throwing one gum wrapper away, you're throwing it into a basket that's already overburdened, then you cannot add any more gum wrappers into this area because it's already saturated or oversaturated with pollutants of all different magnitudes. What we could also have, and what we are fighting for, is local ordinances, changes at the city level. And so, like, a fugitive air dust ordinance was passed about 2 years ago. It covered kind of the dust that the trucks kick up. However, it didn't cover what we call bulk solids. And what these are large hills that are made of pet coke or petroleum coke, metallurgical coke, different types of chemicals or carbon material that are used to fuel the blast furnaces in the steel mill, for example. And if these are not covered, then naturally, as the wind blows, it blows up the tiniest of the particles, which are called particulate matter, into the air, that end up becoming the soot on your windowsill, that end up becoming the particulate matter in your lungs. We're also pushing for anti-idling ordinances, which would prevent trucks from sitting and running their engines for an hour in the middle of a residential block. We're looking at trying to undo the damage of urban renewal that was done by Mayor Hubbard and continues on into this day, specifically up until the last administration, with Mayor O'Reilly's trying to change some of the zoning of the area to create the Detroit Intermodal Freight Terminal, which is another animal we're fighting, another beast. They're continuously buying businesses and homes and converting them into industrial properties. Another thing that we're fighting on the local level is also preventing trees and green space from coming down and being made into parking lots or being made into businesses. We have an auto supplier that was recently granted permission last year on Rotunda and Schaefer that destroyed the ball fields, baseball fields, as well as trees that were decades and decades old, and replaced it with a building and a huge parking lot. This contributes to a lot of the, obviously trees reduce pollution. It contributes to more pollution because of the automation that's the traffic that's going to be going over there. It increases our flooding into the area. We're also looking at, as I mentioned, some of the steps that included air filtration at the schools. We're looking at trying to get another supplemental environmental project that would allow air purifiers into the homes that would possibly help the mosque get an air filtration, which is like a local religious, almost like a church for Muslims, where people congregate to have the clean air in there, and in different centers, community centers. We're looking at another big piece, essentially having more representation of the minority in the municipality, in the state government, so that we can advocate for ourselves. And ultimately, that's the bottom line, because if you don't have representation in government, then you really are not going to have any protection with government. It requires a lot of the residents doing grassroots level work. Myself, I'm a single mom with 2 jobs, 2 kids, an elderly mother with cancer. And we have to do the legwork on knocking on our neighbors' doors or passing out flyers or holding town halls to educate our community, sending out videos and flyers in order to get people to either get elected or get them to show up at different EGLE meetings or permit hearings or council meetings. So it's really there's a need for more people on the ground to help in this endeavor, to help educate people, to help tell them their rights, and to help get them to show up and voice their concerns or their frustrations, or voice just their story. Like, tell me your story. Your daughter was in their 20s and died of cancer. Tell the story so that people can understand that this has real life implications on people like us. It really does. We're dying. We're literally dying. I don't call this I think environmental justice or environmental injustice is a sugar-coated term for environmental racism, which is an even more sugar-coated term for corporate genocide. You're literally killing a group of people, a minority group of people, and knowingly doing it and increasing their burden day by day by day, without any remorse or care, only so that there's profits at the end of it. Next slide. So I'll finish off by handing it over back to Natalie, who is doing an amazing project to touch on my last point, which is educating our community. I'm not sure if it was Natalie or Zeina. I apologize, but go ahead.
No worries. Thank you, Samra'a. So with this ongoing threat of environmental racism and corporate genocide, and with this desire to find solutions, several community partners in Metro Detroit designed the pilot of the community-based academic partnership known as Environmental Health Research to Action, or EHRA for short. EHRA's mission is to build skills and intergenerational knowledge in environmental health, community science, and policy advocacy to address these cumulative environmental exposures in Dearborn and neighboring communities. So in 2018, EHRA held its first Summer Youth Academy, which is a 2-week-long series of interactive sessions on topics ranging from air pollution 101 to community-led science to policy advocacy 101. And over the past 4 years, EHRA has grown and evolved to serve over 60 plus students between the ages of 16 and 18 since its founding, expanded its geographical reach beyond just Dearborn and Dearborn Heights to include students from cities like Detroit and Melvindale. And upon request from our students last year, we've improved our curriculum to include water issues in addition to just air quality in our curriculum. And I also want to recognize that all this work truly would not be possible without the contributions of local organizations and leaders in our community, like CAPHE, like the M-LEEaD Center, Access, and the other organizations and institutions listed on the slide. So on the next slide, to give you all a feel of what this academy is all about and the impact it has on our students, we wanted to share this video that was taken during the 2019 Summer Youth Academy. The video features some personal narratives from our students, in addition to actual footage that was taken during some of our Academy sessions. So Meredith, if you could please.
I live in the south end of Dearborn, which is highly polluted.
The air is unclean, it smells so bad.
I ended up getting asthma.
I never realized the amount of toxins and chemicals that are going into our bodies.
They would have a little machine and they'd put it in my mouth and it would help me breathe better.
My cousin, like 3 months ago, he died because of the asthma. Everyone's getting affected. It's just sad.
I can't just stay and do nothing about it. All these factories just disgust me.
I'd love it if more people my age were informed of the stuff going on around them and the stuff going on in the community.
There's a lot of desensitization. People feel that, oh, well, it's foregone, there's nothing really we could do. When in reality, the time is now to stop polluting. If not now, then when?
The people who are causing the pollution don't know that it's affecting themselves too. There's no boundaries for pollution.
It kind of like hurt my heart a little bit to know that people had to fight so hard for something that you shouldn't need, you have to fight for.
Can you imagine, for 40 years, we've been exposed to numerous chemicals without our knowledge?
The slag, all my life I thought that was a pile of dirt.
That's not dirt, that's slag, full of manganese. Their houses are right there.
These communities' voices are often ignored, and they're often used by big companies for their own profit and gain.
I think it's now our time to interact with our environment in a healthier, more conscientious way. I found EHRA as a way for myself to get hands-on interaction with not only seeing the environmental issues on a daily basis, but also meeting people who are on the front end of trying to solve the issues.
This academy will help spread the voice of our community to advocate our environmental issues.
If we don't try and fix it or solve the issue, it's going to get worse and it's going to affect younger generations.
I want to do something for my community. So I think by joining EHRA, I could not only help myself, but also help the community as a whole.
It's not like you can stop it.
But that doesn't mean we can't at least slow it down.
That video honestly gives me the chills every time I watch it. I was actually an EHRA student myself in the 2018 Summer Youth Academy when it was first launched, and I really do resonate with every story and emotion that was shared by the students in 2019. And my personal experience, like my personal opinion, what I appreciate most about the Academy is that it not only informs me and educates me about the environmental injustices that I'm living in, but also offers action items and solutions and empowers students to advocate and take action to address these concerns. And a little plug, but our call for 2022 Summer Youth Academy applicants will be opening up soon. So be sure to check out our Instagram and follow us at EHRA Dearborn for more information.
Do you want to go to the next slide? And I could do this one, Zeina. So that said, I joined EHRA, I think it was 2019 or just before COVID hit. So maybe 2020 actually. I joined as a steering committee member. And one of the things that I mentioned as a need is that we needed this grassroots kind of level of advocacy and for people to advocate for themselves. And I'm just going to go to the second bullet first. And the kids themselves being able to come out of the program, they go and they present to either a council or a group or the Attorney General's office. And it's one of the most I mean, it's an amazing feeling to see kids 17, 18, 19 doing this. It's amazing. They learn so much, and they're advocating for their community, for themselves, really, and their family members. But we also need help from the outside as well. We need people in places, people that have the technical knowledge, people that have the experience and expertise, people that have the contacts in different levels of government to apply pressure. We don't need to do cumulative health impact changes through legislation. There was something that was presented to or introduced 2 years ago that is basically dead in committees. The governor herself can actually make those changes herself, but it requires a lot of people, reaching out and making this a priority and telling her, change the administrative rules in EGLE to allow for cumulative health impact studies. And we are heading in that direction. EGLE recently did use, I think, a U of M tool, or is working with U of M on a tool that was developed to test, I guess, if you'll say, or analyze different areas of environmental justice. So we want to make sure that we do get that kind of level of help. Another thing we do need is, as I mentioned, we need the research. We need more people to kind of pay us attention, to provide us with the data that we can use to make a case, whether it's data on air quality or radar that it gets done, or it's data on how many people are sick in the area, or it's data on how many died of XYZ. We need that data to help support our case and make the changes. And then, of course, I'll leave the call to ask for the EHRA specific things to Natalie as far as the needs go. Go ahead, Natalie.
I think you covered the majority of it, right? I think we're always welcoming more folks into the mix in EHRA. It's not, as Zeina alluded to, it's not a lecture type class. It's get out there and connect with community organizers, environmental lawyers, environmental engineers, scientists, staff at EGLE. Listen to Sam and Alum talk about these issues and ask your questions. And so if you think that you might have something to contribute, we'd be happy to chat with you about that. Yeah. Anything else, Zeina, on the call to action that you want to add?
I think just definitely including youth voices and advocacy. I think youth really are strong change makers, and including them in conversations and taking the time to also, educate and mentor them, I think would be my one call to action.
And learn from them. I've learned so much in processes and approach. I studied community organizing and advocacy, but the lessons I've learned on, how to approach that differently from younger people sometimes is really eye-opening and a good reminder that we're always learning. So thank you. Samra'a, I see you on mute. Go ahead.
One thing I would like to add is, I know we touched on this, you and I, Natalie, but if there's anybody out there that has any sorts of funding, grants, or knowledge about any sourcing for financial support for the program, we absolutely would love to expand this to not just youth, and we would expand it to wherever that is interested, if we had the financial means. If there's a way to fund a project coordinator in order to help in that endeavor. And we're looking at also incorporating water pollution and contamination, hopefully this year and going forward. But in order to expand and broaden our horizons, we do need that kind of support as far as grants or even manpower, if somebody's willing to do this, as part of their fellowship, part of their graduate research or something. Anything that we can get, any help that we can get specific to EHRA would be well received and appreciated.
Ditto. And we have much support from M-LEEaD and CAPHE and the Commission for Middle Eastern American Affairs. But yes, there's always more we could do on that front. So next slide, I believe, is our final thank you. We could close out the slides even, and we have a good 10 minutes, which is great. I know I could talk to Zeina and Samra'a for hours. I think a week or two ago when we met, we had a 30-minute meeting plan, and I think we talked for over 2 hours about this stuff, but we want to talk with you all. I see Stuart has his hand up. Stuart Batterman, if you want to unmute and ask your question or throw it in the chat. Oh, Stuart, I'm not sure if you're trying to talk. We can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Actually, that was left up from a prior Zoom meeting.
Ah, gotcha. Well, anything you want to ask or share since we have you in the hot seat?
Good to see you, all. I would just say that the amount of air monitoring in Southwest Detroit is extraordinary, actually. But it doesn't get too far into Dearborn. It doesn't go really north. And so that's an area which we have identified as a little deficient in air monitoring. But in fact, I do raise this at times. Focusing on the couple of pollutants you mentioned is fine, but there are lots of toxics that don't get a lot of monitoring. And the one of particular concern for me these days is formaldehyde.
Thanks, Stuart. We'll have to follow up. Samra'a, did you want to say something?
Yeah, Stuart, I think you bring up a great point. This was actually, there was a permit about a few years ago that went to a public hearing to Eagle from the Dearborn Industrial Generating Plant. And it was actually 2 permits. One of them was the permit to install a component, and the other permit was to increase formaldehyde emissions in the area. So there was an outpouring of community outrage at the public hearing to the extent or point that Eagle said they would never hold a public hearing similar to that one ever again. But as a result of that, the Dearborn DIG withdrew the permit for adding that component. However, and it made it like they made it seem like it was, hey, look, it's a show of good faith on our part. We're going to withdraw this permit, but silently, they still continued with the permit to increase the formaldehyde emissions, and Eagle approved it. In fact, Eagle didn't disapprove. They disapproved 1 permit in the last 20 years. So when we talk about formaldehyde or lead or manganese or any of the other 13 carcinogens plus that are pumped into the air, I blame Eagle for not doing its part. Sure, you approved them because they're technically sound, but you could also have disapproved them based on technicalities as well, based on the fact that there's actually a clause in the administrative rules, I think it's called Rule 19, where it says you're supposed to take in the community's health into consideration. And Eagle never uses that rule, which is why I get back to the governor, whoever is in power has the ability to make those changes in order to reduce the emissions or prevent additional emissions from coming in here. But yeah, that's why we need people like yours help. So just on formaldehyde, I wanted to add that tidbit.
Thanks, Samra'a. And in the call to action for research, I do see we'll have to make sure we connect. I think it's Lila, who mentions a study going on cancer risk, and making sure 25% of the cohort population is of MENA descent in Dearborn and Metro Detroit are going to be some of the first targeted areas for this research study. So we'll have to make sure folks are connected up on that. Other questions in the chat? Not seeing anything pop up. Lots of support for the work that's happening. As you can tell, a lot of people have been working on this for decades, as Zeina and Samra'a have noted. Let's see. We can certainly share contact information, Sarah and others, to do some introductions. I imagine that would be good. So I will throw a question out. We have about 5 minutes left. This is something I know we've talked about a lot in EHRA. So these EJ issues impact Southeast Dearborn, Southwest Detroit, downriver communities, as well as other regions. I'm curious, Sam, if you'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges, some of the opportunities. I know you do a lot of work with folks on this call who are listening in, who are from 48217 or other parts of Southeast Michigan. If you want to maybe talk a little bit about that.
As far as the challenges, the challenges are basically, what I've learned is every community is a bubble. I didn't really realize that until I actually ran for office last year, and I found that there were bubbles in Dearborn in every area. And so when we talk about 48127 in Detroit, there are bubbles of the Delray area, Southwest, Lanyo area. There are bubbles of communities. And what I've personally had difficulty with is connecting and getting into those circles and having them come into mine. Similarly, has been an issue for them. My chance, I actually met some folks, including Teresa Landrum and Justin Owiwu and a few others from different areas at a meeting, a town hall meeting that was hosted in our area at Salina Intermediate School. That town hall meeting was disseminated by an Eagle, I would say, friend. It was sent out to interested parties of this area, and it reached other communities, other bubbles, if you will, that came in. I could tell you that meeting and subsequent meetings at like the AK Steel, formerly AK Steel, the steel mill had with the community, having people show up from other communities and stand side by side with us was an eye opener for them. It was scary for them, and you could tell by some of the responses, by them saying they had a lawyer present, the president of the company saying, "We'll shut this meeting down if it gets too much," or their responses were very defensive, very wanting to end it quickly, wanting to just, "We'll take the question, we won't answer it now." So I can tell you that that's been one of the struggles, is connecting with the other communities and showing them that, yeah, pollution has no boundaries. It's in your zip code as well. And maybe you having cancer, your mom having cancer, your sister having tumors, your brother having asthma, that's not familial. That's environmental. Another thing that I have personally to deal with in my community is the cultural shame of having some kind of illness or ailment in your family. A lot of times people think, okay, if people perceive my family as having cancer, then it's a bad sign for marriage, for whatever. And they, culturally will keep these things private. They believe in karma or bad juju or an evil eye. And so these things that play in people's minds, it's hard to combat that and break that thought process and tell them, you know what? No, it's not something that's your family to blame. It is something externally that is to blame, and you're not the only one suffering for it. I'm not going to be able to know this person has cancer because the family's hiding it. I'm not going to be able to know this resident has COPD because their family's scared to admit it publicly. So getting the numbers out from people, getting the true actual numbers of health disparities in this area is also a secondary thing that we're struggling with. Those just happen to be the two right off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's more that I can think of down the road.
Thanks, Samra'a. And I think we're 1 minute out here. Dr. Schultz also mentions, the great work of these cohort studies, but, needing data that we might already have access to. And so starting to strategize perhaps on advocacy. We know that Dearborn has a new mayor who is trained as an epidemiologist. So we think there's some good work happening thinking about these issues within the local administration, of course, as well.
I do want to add to that Mayor Hammoud so far has been receptive to some of the suggestions regarding the anti-idling ordinance or fugitive air dust ordinance recommendations for amendments that we've made as a community. So I am hopeful, and the public health director, which is a new position he's created. He hasn't started yet, but we're excited to meet with him and see where it can go as far as changing the dynamics of the Southend to have a better or cleaner environment.
Thank you. So we are at time. I want to thank Zeina and Samra'a and all of you for taking this time today to join us and learn a bit about the South End. Hopefully, if you haven't spent time there, you do. And I think some connections have been made. So stay tuned and go on the M-LEEaD site for recordings of these and other presentations. Thank you, everyone.